All right, hi everyone. Welcome to this week where we are going to be talking about autism and the brain. And I decided to give autism its own week in a sense because as I think there's a lot of reasons actually. One, I think is its growing prevalence is that autism, unlike a lot of other neuropsychiatric disorders that we'll talk about next week, is rapidly growing. And I'll show you some data in a little bit that shows you what I mean by that. And so one of it is that it's an issue that's going to be definitely more and more important as we go forward in the 21st century for no other reason just than it's becoming more and more prevalent. And then the other thing is that because I think that a lot of people think about autism a little incorrectly in the world, and they have a few misconceptions or some preconceived notions that aren't quite right. So I thought it'd be good to really focus on it in particular. And then next week we'll talk about neuropsychiatric disorders a little more broadly. For those of you taking abnormal, maybe some of that will be a little bit of review. And it's there that we'll talk about things like schizophrenia, post-traumatic stress, depression, and we'll relate it back to a lot of the different things we've talked about. So, post-traumatic stress in the amygdala, so on and so forth. But let's dive into talking about autism. And specifically, we will start with what is autism? And then we'll talk about things like how do we diagnose it, what causes it, and then we'll spend a good amount of time talking about the behavioral and neural signatures of autism. And then we'll wrap up talking about how we treat autism, which, to give you a preview, though, we can do very, very quickly because we don't have great treatments for right now. Okay, but let's focus on what autism is. So autism is a disorder that is characterized by many different sorts of deficits and impairments. So one such domain is the social domain, that people who are autistic have problems with communication. They struggle to understand people's intentions, what they're trying to communicate to them. They self-isolate quite a bit. They're a little bit more reclusive a lot of times. So there are social deficits. There are action deficits. They oftentimes, especially as they get more severe cases of autism, they will have very restricted, repetitive patterns of speech and behavior. They'll very, very regimented also in the small sort of scope of things that they will do, which can be related, of course, to the isolation. There are cognitive deficits where they will be highly focused and have very fixed interest on particular things. And then last is what is called a sensory deficit, where they can have a lot of sensitivity to sensory input. So a lot of times people with severe autism, they might go into, like a restaurant, they can get overwhelmed by sensory overload. They might go to a movie and it can be very kind of overwhelming because of all the flashing bright lights and so on and so forth. And of course, autism has been widely represented in mainstream culture, especially more and more recently. I actually think that as the number of cases have increased steadily in the world, I think also the representation of autism has increased similarly. So I think maybe one of the most famous instances of someone being represented as potentially being on the autism spectrum is this guy, Sheldon Cooper, who's in the show called The Big Bang Theory. A lot of you probably have not ever seen the movie Rain Man because it's from like the 80s or something. But if any of you happen to have seen Rain Man with Dustin Hoffman and Tom Cruise, Dustin Hoffman is a severe form of autism. If there are any fans of the show Community, I'm a really big fan of the show Community. Abed Nadir is thought to be autistic. They reference it and talk about it pretty openly. There's a show on CBS that I've not seen called The Good Doctor, where there's this guy who has pretty severe autism, but he's still relatively high functioning, but he's a very successful surgeon. I don't know much about this show on Netflix called Atypical, but I do know that the lead character in it also has autism. I'm sure there's other cases that I'm not thinking of, but that can help you get a sense from watching and thinking about these characters. It can help start to develop at least some intuitions about what it can sometimes be like to interact with people who are on the spectrum. Though, of course, it should be taken with a grain of salt because these are intended to be, dramatic representations for entertainment in a lot of cases, not education. So, it might give you an intuition, but don't take it as gospel, of course. Now, a big thing about autism that I'm sure some of you are familiar with this is this idea that it is a spectrum disorder. There's actually a saying in the autism community, which is that autism is such a wide and diverse spectrum that they say, quote, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And the idea behind it is that every single person can be somewhere different on the spectrum, that one person is not going to be reflective of what other people are going to be whatsoever, and that people can be very heterogeneous and very unique in a lot of ways. Now, it's easy to think of a spectrum disorder as being one dimension, that you might think like, oh, there's the severe cases, the mild cases, and then the less severe cases. You might think it's just one dimension and that everyone falls somewhere on this one dimension. That's actually not true. It's not just a linear spectrum, because what's going on is that you can actually have every person being unique because they're on a bunch of different types of spectrum. So you could have, right here, we're just representing 5 of the different spectrums: speech, intelligence, sensory needs, so on and so forth. And everyone who is somewhere on the autism spectrum could be placed on any number of these dimensions in slightly different ways. So it's not just like one point on the spectrum, on a single linear spectrum. It's one point, but on a point on multiple different sorts of spectrums. And so that's how you get a sort of multidimensional spectrum. And the fact that it is so multidimensional makes diagnosing autism rather difficult. There is not a single marker or a single test, but instead there's a suite of observations and assessments that clinicians will try to do if they're trying to determine where someone might land on the spectrum. And the sorts of things that these clinicians will look for are impairments in social interactions across a bunch of different contexts, nonverbal communication, developmental issues with social interaction, and so forth. Like I said, they'll look for those restrictive or repetitive activities and so on and so forth. And there is probably the most well-established diagnostic criteria, which is that's a test that's called the ADOS, the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule. And it is a thing that is pretty standard. There's like a set kind of way that you go through it, but even, it itself, while it might be the most well-known sort of criterion, it's not as if it is itself a definitive thing. It's not exactly like that score on the ADOS will tell you for sure one thing or the other. And so the way that it works, it has a lot of dimensions to it there, especially in children. There's a free play element to it where you let a child play with a set group of toys. You see how they interact with those toys. You see how the child responds to his name, responds to joint attention. By joint attention, it's like, hey, look over there. And you see if the child kind of tracks your attention with you, how typical conversation goes. Interactive play, now where you're playing with the child, you're saying, give me this, give me that. Like, let's do this. We'll build things together. Telling stories from pictures. This is this idea where like you can show almost like comic book panels, and you have a child try to come up with a story from looking at those comic book panels. Sorry that it's overlapped with the number at the bottom. And then also commenting on others' emotions, sort of trying to do like trying to get a sense of what the child thinks other people are thinking, and so on and so forth. Now, the reason that I keep talking about children is that because a lot of time, more and more people are trying to be able to diagnose autism earlier and earlier to try to help and give, interventions and therapies to help the child long-term. And it actually turns out that symptoms can be, in certain cases, visible at 18 months. Sometimes they're not until later. They might be 3 or even 4 years old. And so you'll have parents who might start noticing that their child might not be developing typically. And so they might start to have these symptoms. And so you needed to come up with a set of tests for the ADOS that were child-friendly, as it were. So let me show you some videos of child behavior that will give you a sense of how you would identify a child that does and does not have autism. Okay, so let's watch this video together.
This 19-month-old child does not show signs of ASD. He has chosen to play with the balls. He quickly integrates the lady into his play. He pretends that the balls are food and offers a bite to the lady.
He pretends a lot of stuff is food, and he always wants you to
offers
eat
it to you. Okay. You're making some yummy food.
He understands that food, spoons, plates, and eating go together.
Mommy.
As he creates a pretend play activity, he remains aware of the people nearby. He enjoys incorporating social interaction into his play and offers the lady a bite.
Thank you. That sure is tasty.
He is able to pay attention to the lady, the doll, and the pretend food all at once. He shares his excitement about the toys with the lady, looking at her and smiling. After the lady comments that the food is hot, he links his play and language to her idea.
It's okay now. It's cool. It's nice and cool now. Yeah.
This 19-month-old child shows signs of ASD. He has an intense interest in the toy phone.
Toys R Us is
He does not share his enjoyment of the phone with others.
set up like the classroom.
He does not look toward others and smile.
Shelves, you know, sensory, all kinds. He really has this addiction to telephones lately, though. It's okay though, because it's helping him to make sounds. So there's probably like 10 telephones laying around my house because he walks around carrying them and sits them down, and then he goes on to the next one.
Although he puts the phone to his ear, he does not show creative play with the phone. When his name is called, he does not respond.
Elliot. Ellie. Ellie. Elliot.
He does not offer the phone to others so that they can have a turn.
He would turn to his name, and progressively he's not.
His mother tries to distract his attention away from the phone.
Let mommy see the phone. Let mommy see it. Let mommy see the phone.
Are you being difficult now? There you are.
She begins to tickle him. Although he seems to enjoy the tickling, he does not look at his mother or make a social connection with her. He does not try to communicate with his mom to keep the social game going.
Okay, so that was just to give you a sense of the different sort of behavioral differences you can see just from observing two children who are about 18 months old who are on the autism spectrum and who are not. And as I was saying, you know, even though this is pretty young, the hope obviously would definitely be even to get it younger and younger and younger, because the earlier you go, the younger you are. As we've learned about, there's that plasticity in the brain, the greater possibility that there is for treatment, help, intervention, therapies, and so forth. So a question that people often wonder is there any way that you can detect it in younger children, specifically infants? People are actively working on it. There's nothing quite yet that's being considered as like the definitive one, but I can at least tell you about one study that is people very hopeful. And so this is a eye tracking study where you just basically actually naturally see where the children look when they are shown images of faces and so forth. And what you actually find is that infants who later develop autism are less likely to look at the person's eyes to make eye contact than people who will later develop and not have autism. So here, let's watch that. So here is a baby. That's the screen they're looking at. This apparatus down here is tracking their eyes. And so this is just, like I said, a little eye tracking study. And this fixation cross thing is showing you where the infant is looking. And so this here is a typical individual, or a neurotypical individual rather, who will grow up and not have autism or anything like that. And now we will compare it to what happens when there is a baby who later develops autism. So let's check this out. So here you can see that this baby is not making eye contact in the same way as the other one, looking at the mouth, looking at the colors behind the woman. And so this is just kind of one example of the different types of tools and opportunities that clinicians and doctors are trying to take advantage of to figure out a way that you can maybe sort of identify people who are at risk for developing autism earlier and earlier and earlier. And I really want to stress, this is by no means perfect. This is by no means a diagnostic trait, but this is something that maybe people could use if, for example, they come from a family where autism is already in the family, so there might be a genetic predisposition, or if there are other risk factors, some of which we'll go into in a little bit. It might be a way that you can sort of kind of start to at least, you know, get some pieces of evidence that maybe your child is predisposed to developing autism later. And this is a thing that there's a lot of investment and a lot of time and energy in, because there is an increase in the rise of autism pretty much every year that goes by. There's been a rate, I'm sure you've heard that the prevalence rate of autism in the United States is increasing right now. It's at, actually, this is from about 10 years ago. So it's 1 in 68 about 10 years ago. I believe it's a little bit higher now. And so what you can actually also see is that not only are the rates pretty high in the United States, they're high in a lot of other places as well. But I should mention, though, that prevalence rates are not consistent across the globe. You know, as you can see, the rates in the United States and even in Iceland are very different from one another. The United States and Iran, even more different from one another. The United States and Israel and Iran are somewhat similar to one another. And this suggests that it's either that our diagnostic criteria for autism is not universal, or our ability to recognize autism in societies may vary widely. So for example, prevalence rates in the United States, United Kingdom, and East Asia are kind of a similar magnitude, but Israel, or even to a certain extent Australia, they'd be seeing very different. So this could just be a cultural issue. It could be that the diagnostic criteria clinicians use are different from one another. It's not entirely agreed upon why there are these differences. But one thing that is agreed upon about these differences is that there are consistently higher rates of autism amongst males than females. And so here, these are a bunch of states in the United States. The red are males, the yellow are females, and it's the vertical axis is the number of cases per 1,000 children. And so broadly speaking, it's thought that there are about 1 in 42 male-born children will have autism, whereas in females, it'll be on the order more of 1 out of 189 or so on and so forth. Now, why is this the case? Why is the prevalence rate so much higher amongst males than females? There's a lot of competing theories. I know some theories say that it actually has something to do with testosterone, and the differences in testosterone levels are having some sort of genetic impact on autism. And since male children have more testosterone than females, that's why it's happening. Another theory, which is actually gaining some traction, is what it's almost called the boys will be boys theory. And the idea of it is, imagine you have 2 children, okay? And you're at, I don't know, some family picnic or something. And there's 2 5-year-olds. And one's a little boy and one's a little girl. And the little boy is in the mud, he's climbing on trees, he's not really listening, he's just being a crazy little guy. A lot of times, it's actually been clinically observed, and this isn't just anecdotes, there's through observational studies that you can do this, you'll actually find that the parents or the guardians are less likely to intervene with that kind of behavior when it's a boy compared to when it's a girl. If it's a girl playing in the mud, if it's a girl climbing the trees, the parents and the guardians are way more likely to be like, no, we don't do that. And so since there are these different sort of societal expectations on males and females, there's going to also be differences in sort of how these children are sort of kind of coached and encouraged and disciplined as in terms of their behavior as they're growing up. The idea being that there's a certain sort of societal pressures that might be put on one gender and not the other. And so in a sense, by saying to, the little girl playing in the mud, no, we don't do that, you're giving her from a very early age a certain amount of, behavioral therapy that the little boys just won't get, because it's just like, oh, little boys, whatever. So hence the boys will be boys theory. Now, a natural question to wonder is, why is the number of autism cases rising? So this here is just showing you the difference between males and females, but on the previous slide, I showed you that figure where you could see on the left upmost panel that like the number of cases in the United States are rising every year. And this is true across the globe. And to answer that question, I think it's important to have a sense of what exactly is thought to cause autism, because what's causing autism and understanding the causes of it can also help you understand why the cases are rising. I actually just decided, why don't we take a little bit break there? So we'll stop real quick. When we come back, we'll have the next video dive straight into the causes of autism. So see you in a second.